Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie. And today's episode, we are getting into episode 2 of our series on porn. Last episode, we talked about how porn isn't really about sex, its impact on our nervous system and how dopamine works, and why slowly cutting back or moderation doesn't actually work. I also talked about how porn provides novelty, which actually creates a flat effect or a flat line for what is familiar. In today's episode, we'll be talking about problematic porn use, predictability, relational capacity, and how porn impacts relationships. Most conversations about porn and whether porn is problematic focus on behavior. How much time do you spend viewing porn? How often? And whether somebody should stop. But what often gets missed is something more subtle and also more impactful. Porn doesn't just shape behavior, it shapes what the nervous system learns to expect from connection. And what it teaches isn't intimacy, it teaches predictability. Predictability feels like safety, but they're not the same thing. I often say predictability is knowing what will happen, whereas relational safety is knowing what happens when things don't go as planned. And healthy relationships require uncertainty. There can't just be predictability in relationships. There will be things that don't happen as planned. There will be times where there is conflict. And so healthy relationships require misattunement. They require negotiation, waiting, and repair. Porn removes all of that. It offers certainty without any vulnerability. It offers arousal without negotiation. And it offers connection with no risk. Over time, that reshapes what feels tolerable in real relationships. I want to share a conversation I had with my husband the other night. It wasn't a huge conversation, didn't last hours, maybe just 15 minutes as we were driving home. It was just an ordinary moment in our relationship. But I think in relationships, ordinary moments matter. They're where relational capacity actually show up. So the other day, when we woke up in the morning, my husband was telling me that he had a dream that night. And when he woke up activated. He woke up like we had been fighting in his dream. I asked him what the dream was about. And at that time, he couldn't remember. So I left and went to work. He works from home, so he did his thing that day. And that night, we went out to dinner and we were driving home after dinner. And he told me that he had remembered what the dream was about. He said, I don't think it was really a fight, but we were having a conversation. It felt competitive, which we're not necessarily competitive with each other. Not seriously. Sometimes we'll joke about that. If we're fighting or if there's conflict and we can't agree on something, I'll lighten the tension by saying, I know, we'll solve this by having a spelling contest. Because I am a pretty good speller and my husband is not so much. In fact, in the fifth grade, I won the school spelling bee. I was the spelling bee champion for my school. But my husband also knows that when I say that, my intention is to lift the tension a little bit, to lighten things so that it doesn't have to be so serious. And usually then we can figure out what we're going to do, or we can come to some type of resolution. So back to the dream, he's telling me that we were having a conversation about which one of us is more physically affectionate with the other. And in his dream, I was explaining why it was me. And he was giving me reasons why it was him. And he smiled at that point in real life as we're driving home and said, I won, which is an inside joke for us. And I laughed and said, how did that feel to win? But then I followed it up with a real question. And I asked him, do you think I'm not physically affectionate enough with you? And he responded and said, I understand your history, and I understand why physical affection isn't always easy for you. But yeah, I would like more. And I asked him, do you think I've improved over the years? And he said, oh, absolutely. And I shared with him my first instinct when you were telling me what we were talking about in your dream. My first instinct was, oh, we're probably equal. But pretty quickly, just in my head, I realized, actually, I don't think that's true. I would also say he is more physically affectionate than I am. And it's not that I don't touch him or hold his hand or kiss him. I do. He said, I would just like some more. And I said, I can work on that. And then I asked him, were you aware that you had that need before you had the dream? And he said, maybe. I'm not always aware of my needs. So it might have been in the background, but the dream brought it forward. And I accepted that and said, yeah, that makes sense. We talked about how physical affection had evolved over the course of our relationship. And there's also room for me to expand. And I told them, I appreciate you bringing that up with me. I appreciate having this conversation. And I will be more mindful of this. This isn't something I can't do. I'm at a place in my life where if it's on my radar, I can work on it. What mattered most to me in that conversation was this. I didn't experience what he said as criticism. I actually experienced it as desire. Desire for me and from me. And I think part of why I could receive it that way was because he made it safe. He acknowledged my history. He knows I grew up with physical violence, with no safe touch, in a family that didn't hug and didn't say, I love you. In fact, he witnessed that a couple of times, and it was shocking for him. So when he said he wanted more physical affection, it did not come across as a demand. It was just an invitation that also remembered and acknowledged who I am. Now, I want to say something here because our marriage has not been perfect. Not all of our ordinary moments over the years were this clean or this simple. We're coming up on our 33rd anniversary next month. And 33 years in, we are a lot better at this now. I think part of what has helped us get better is that we have had decades of practice. Safety and security do require some history. You can't get a lot of security without some time passing. But you don't build security simply by letting time pass, because time passing just creates familiarity. Security, though, is built through what happens inside the relationship over time. It's built through moments like this one, but also through a lot messier moments. Moments where that didn't go well. Moments where it took us 2 or 3 days or a week to get to that place. Where one of us got defensive. Where repair took longer than it should have. And so I want to be clear that security does not require perfect moments. That one was easy. It was simple. It was a win for us. But they're not all like that. Security doesn't require perfect moments. It requires repair. Even messy moments can build security when the relationship doesn't abandon repair. I share that moment between us with you because I think that moment captures the difference between predictability and relational safety or security. I want to talk today in this episode why porn doesn't just affect behavior, but it reshapes our capacity for intimacy. When we're talking about porn, I often say porn trains the nervous system to expect certainty without negotiation. There's no need to consider another person's internal world. There's no need to tolerate differences. There's no need to risk hearing, "I want more," or "that didn't work for me." In real relationships, desire has to be mutual or it doesn't work. Mutuality in relationship says, "I agree to be impacted by you." It means wanting without demanding. And it means holding desire alongside history, context, and limitations. All of that takes capacity. It will require us to expand. Porn doesn't just meet needs. It actually bypasses the development of that capacity. So let's slow this down and talk about what porn actually does inside a relationship, especially to the partner's nervous system. One of the things I say about porn is always available, and that availability matters. When someone is acting out sexually outside the home with another person, they're physically gone. There's an absence that can be named. And often there's a rupture that partners can point to. But porn is different. Porn actually just reorganizes daily life quietly, staying up late and being tired the next day, being irritable, or being mentally elsewhere. Partners often can't name what's wrong, but their body knows. Something feels off. Something feels missing. Many partners live in a state of low-grade vigilance, waiting, wondering, adjusting. And because the person is technically home, partners can often get confused and blame themselves for feeling lonely. They'll look at themselves and say, okay, what can I do? What am I not doing? And that's especially true for women who are parenting. Parenting can make it easy to look at the loneliness in the relationship and blame yourself. But it also happens for partners who are married and don't have kids, but they still feel emotionally single. Often I get a question that's a pretty specific question from partners, because often if they have not acted out outside of the marriage with another person and all they've had problems with are porn, that can be mistaken for being less severe. Now, I don't see it that way. And as CSATs, we're not trained to see it that way. But often partners will ask a specific question, and sometimes it's coming because they've had the argument. Partners feel in their body when they find out about the porn use, this is cheating. And often the other person pushes back because another person wasn't involved. Another real physical person in real life wasn't involved. And I think that question, why does it feel like cheating in the partner's body, deserves a real answer. The way I answer it is cheating isn't just about another body. It's about where intimacy lives. Porn directs sexual energy outside the relationship. It creates an erotic world the partner isn't invited into. And it removes consent from intimacy. Desire is happening, but it's not shared with the partner. And I think that's why it feels like cheating, why it is a betrayal. Not just because of what's being watched, but because of what's being withdrawn. Porn doesn't just steal time, it steals presence. Another question I often get is a pornography addiction different than a sex addiction? So let me also give a clear answer for that question. In the research, sex addiction is the umbrella term. And under that umbrella, there's multiple ways that the addiction organizes. I think currently in the research, there's 14. When I first became a CSAT, there was 10. So it is starting to expand with additional research. Of those types of sex addiction, porn is one of them. And any of the types of sex addiction can pair. If people have affairs, they may also look at porn. But for those who just look at porn, it's often paired with fantasy. Porn functions differently than other forms of sexual acting out. Like I said, when someone is acting out physically, they often have to leave the house. There's risk. There's exposure. There's a break in the routine that we can put our finger on. And porn doesn't require that. Porn is waiting in the office, in the bedroom, on the phone. And porn finds reasons. Being tired, being stressed, being bored, being irritated. While it's happening, the partner is left holding real life. Parenting alone, managing the household, carrying the emotional labor. The relationship may become where responsibility lives, but porn becomes where relief lives. And partners aren't getting relief. So what is the impact to partners? Over time, partners often describe a very similar pattern. They are irritable. They're tired. They're exhausted. They feel the emotional absence. Conversations with their partner feel flat. Connection feels forced. And the partner starts shrinking their needs. Not because they don't matter, but because asking feels pointless. And this is often where partners will later say, I lost myself. Because when you stop sharing, stop engaging in dialogue that grows you, you stop naming what matters to you, staying connected to yourself becomes painful. You're still in the relationship, but you can no longer be fully in yourself. And that kind of loneliness isn't just about missing your partner. It's about being unable to bring your full self into the relationship without feeling unseen, dismissed, or alone. Over time, the cost isn't just disconnection from your partner. It's the disconnection from yourself. And this is how trust erodes without a single event. It's many events. Many partners say, I can't point to just one moment or one thing, but I stopped trusting my experience. And they're not imagining that. That's their nervous system responding to chronic absence. I want to pause for a minute in the episode and say, none of this is a benchmark for where you should already be. This episode offers a direction, not a measure of success or failure. Many people come into relationships or into recovery without ever having been taught how to stay present, how to repair, or how to tolerate emotional complexity. And that isn't a personal failing. It's a capacity that gets built over time. So if you're listening and realizing that you're not there yet, nothing has gone wrong. There is one more impact of porn that I want to name. Because it shows up in relationships, whether people intend it to or not. Porn doesn't just shape arousal. It shapes perception, especially of women. Most mainstream porn trains the viewer to see women as always available, always interested, always responsive, unaffected by what's happening, which sends the message that there's no need to consider her inner world. No need to notice hesitation, fatigue, ambivalence, or boundaries. And over time, that doesn't just affect sexual expectations. It affects relational expectations. Women become something to be accessed rather than someone to be related to. And even when men consciously reject that idea, the conditioning still shows up in subtle ways. Partners often feel this as a shift in tone, being looked at instead of seen, being touched instead of met, and being desired without being known. And many women can't always explain why it feels dehumanizing. It just does. And this is another reason porn often feels like a betrayal. It doesn't just take sexual energy out of the relationship. It also changes how that energy returns. Desire for the partner often comes back with less curiosity, less patience, less attuned. And for partners, that creates distance, even when the relationship is technically intact. What we repeatedly consume shapes what feels normal, expected, and tolerable, especially under stress. Real intimacy requires seeing women as full subjects with inner lives, thoughts, opinions, knowledge, not just as a means of regulation or relief. And this is why intimacy often feels harder after porn use ends. Not because porn is gone, but because something was never built. When the certainty with porn disappears, people are left with uncertainty, often with a slower sexual arousal. They're left feeling emotionally exposed. They might be left waiting, not knowing how to negotiate in their relationship. And all of those things that are very normal in relationships can feel intolerable if the nervous system has been trained to avoid them. Porn didn't just regulate arousal. It prevented the development of tolerance for relational complexity. Sometimes this is why long-term relationships get labeled as boring. But as I've said before, boredom is often a misinterpretation. Slowness isn't a lack of desire. Ambiguity isn't rejection. And emotional presence isn't inefficiency. Porn narrows desire by training it to require speed, certainty, and control. Real intimacy asks us to stay present when the outcome isn't guaranteed. Which is why healing isn't about perfection, isn't about perfect restraint, better rules, or better filters. Healing and recovery actually require building capacity. Capacity to tolerate longing. Capacity to stay present in uncertainty. And capacity to hear desire without collapsing into shame or defensiveness. Security isn't knowing what will happen. That's predictability. If predictability happens within security, then that's fine. We're more likely to predict when we're in conflict that this is going to resolve, that repair will happen, and we're more likely to focus on regulating ourselves so that we can make a repair, receive a repair, or whatever needs to happen for the relationship to return after conflict. But still, security isn't knowing what will happen. It's simply predicting and having that inner knowing that the relationship is going to survive. As we wrap this up, I want to do a couple of things. First, I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. But for those of you who know that your problematic porn use is a problem and that it impacts your partner, I'm simply trying to name what many people have been feeling, often without language, for a very long time. Porn doesn't just affect the person who's using it. It shapes relationships, it shapes nervous systems, and it shapes our capacity to be present, available, and how safe it feels to bring your full self into connection. So in this episode, we talked about predictability versus security, and about how time alone doesn't create safety. Repair does. About how loneliness in relationships isn't always about just being alone, but also about slowly losing access to yourself. And then I also talked about how porn can quietly reorganize relationships around absence, pulling intimacy away, narrowing desire, and leaving partners carrying the weight of real life on their own. If you're listening and you realize this describes us, and that doesn't feel good, I want to be clear, this isn't a diagnosis. It's certainly not a verdict. And it isn't a measure of how good or bad your relationship is. It's information that helps you understand why things feel the way they do and what might actually need attention. Or maybe your partner is sober and things didn't change. This will give you ideas for what needs to be addressed next. This isn't easy work. So I do suggest working with a licensed therapist who is trained to work in this area. Healing doesn't start with fixing everything, but it does start with capacity. Maybe small at first. It will grow over time. Capacity to notice, capacity to stay present a little bit longer each time, and capacity to risk saying something that matters. Security isn't built through perfect conversations or sudden insight. It's built through return and repetition, through repair, through moments where the relationship doesn't disappear when something hard is named. So as you sit with this, you might ask yourself, where has predictability replaced safety in my relationship? And where over time might there be room for something more secure to grow? Porn trains certainty. Intimacy, however, requires capacity. And capacity is something that can be built. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.